London, autumn 1919. The mahogany table in the Bank of England's conference room had witnessed 2 centuries of empire. Portraits of governors past stared down from oak-panelled walls as a circle of men in morning coats studied ledgers by gaslight. Outside, fog rolled through streets, still celebrating victory. Inside, the atmosphere was funeral. Sir Harold Wentworth, deputy governor, age 53, ran his finger down columns of figures he'd reviewed a dozen times. The numbers hadn't changed. Britain's war debt stood at £7 billion, more than the entire national income. France owed even more. Germany's economy was a smoking crater. But this was temporary, surely. Britain still commanded the seas. The city of London remained the world's financial capital. The gold standard would be restored. Order would return. A young clerk entered, footsteps echoing on marble. His face was pale. "Sir Harold, urgent cable from Washington." Wentworth took the paper. His hand began to tremble. "The Americans are refusing to extend the credit terms. They're demanding—" He couldn't finish. Around the table, heads lifted. "They're demanding we borrow from them, at commercial rates, with gold as collateral." Silence. Then a rustle of papers as someone produced another document, freshly decoded from New York. "There's more, gentlemen." The voice came from Lord Cunliffe, former governor, his jowls sagging. U.S. Treasury gold reserves now exceed the combined holdings of Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. Combined. The room temperature seemed to drop. For the first time in 300 years, Europe was not the center of the financial world. For the first time in modern history, the old world needed permission from the new. And in that smoke-filled room, a terrible truth crystallized. America wasn't just a creditor. It was becoming the world's banker. This is the story of that realization, and why that single shift in power still controls the world today. 6 months earlier, spring 1919, Paris. Émile Durand stepped out of his motor car onto the Quai d'Orsay, adjusting his silk cravat. At 49, he was one of the youngest senior advisors to the French Treasury, a man who'd spent the war coordinating loans, managing gold shipments, and ensuring the francs kept flowing to the front. Now, with victory secured, his real work could begin, extracting reparations from Germany and restoring France to its rightful place at the center of European finance. The peace conference was theater, really. America's President Wilson pranced about with his naive idealism, his 14 points, his League of Nations. The British postured about their empire. But Durand knew the truth. Wars were won with steel and blood, but peace was built on gold and credit. And France, despite its devastation, still understood these things better than anyone. He entered the ministry building, passing beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed the Congress of Vienna. His assistant, a nervous young man named Philippe, hurried alongside. "Monsieur Durand, the preliminary figures from the Reparations Commission." Yes, 132 billion gold marks. The Germans will pay for a generation." Durand smiled. "As they should. But, monsieur, there is concern about their capacity." "Capacity?" Durand stopped walking. "Philippe, do you know how much gold Germany possessed in 1914? Their Reichsbank was the envy of Europe. They will pay. They must pay. The mathematics of victory demand it." What Durand didn't say, couldn't admit, even to himself, was that France's own gold reserves had been hemorrhaging for 4 years. Every shell fired at Verdun, every rifle shipped to the front, every ton of American wheat had been purchased with gold flowing eastward across the Atlantic. But this was temporary. Reparations would restore the balance. The European system would stabilize. France and Britain would resume their eternal dance of financial competition and cooperation. America was rich, yes, but rich the way a merchant was rich, through trade, through selling goods. They lacked sophistication. They had no central bank until 1913, for God's sake. They were children playing at finance while Europe had been managing the gold standard for generations. Durant reached his office, a room with tall windows overlooking the Seine. On his desk lay a leather portfolio marked Confidentiel. Inside were reports from the Banque de France. He opened it, lit a cigarette, and began to read. 5 minutes later, the cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. The numbers were impossible. During the war, France had sold 2.3 billion francs worth of gold to the United States. Britain had sold even more. Russia's gold had vanished into American vaults as the Tsarist government collapsed. German gold, confiscated, had been shipped to London and then, where? Much of it to New York, to pay for American loans. Durant's hands shook as he turned pages. A graph showed European gold reserves, 1914 versus 1918. The line fell off a cliff. Another graph showed American gold reserves over the same period. The line climbed like a cathedral spire. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. Philippe appeared in the doorway. "Monsieur, are you—" "Get me the London cables, all correspondence with the Bank of England regarding gold settlements, and Philippe—" Durant's voice was hoarse. "Find out exactly how much we still owe the Americans." The answer, when it came 3 hours later, made him feel physically ill. France owed the United States $4 billion. Britain owed even more. The loans had seemed manageable during the war, emergency measures, to be settled between allies after victory. But now, with peace declared, the Americans were behaving like bankers, not brothers. They wanted repayment. In gold, with interest. Durant stood at his window as dusk fell over Paris. Across the river, the Eiffel Tower stood dark against purple clouds. The city had survived 4 years of German artillery, survived the influenza, survived the loss of a generation. But this was different. For the first time, a cold thought entered his mind. What if we don't control the system anymore? He pushed it away. Impossible. Europe had managed the world's finances since the Renaissance. The Rothschilds, the Barings, the great banking houses, they were all European. America had money, yes, but money without wisdom was just paper. Still, that night, Durant slept poorly. In his dreams, gold flowed westward across a dark ocean, an endless stream of coins vanishing into the night. New York City, October 1920. The ship docked at sunrise, and Durant's first view of Manhattan was through morning mist. A forest of steel and stone rising from the water, like nothing Europe had ever built. The skyscrapers seemed almost violent in their ambition, towers competing to pierce the sky. He'd seen photographs, of course, but photographs couldn't capture the scale, the raw energy of vertical construction. "Impressive, no?" said Sir Harold Wentworth, standing beside him at the rail. The British delegation had joined the French for this mission, an attempt to renegotiate debt terms, to restore some balance to the post-war financial settlement. "It's much," Durant replied carefully. "They build like children playing with blocks." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Children didn't build like this. The delegation, 10 men representing the French Treasury, Bank of England, and Belgian Finance Ministry, was met at the pier by unsmiling Americans in dark suits. No fanfare, no ceremonial greeting, just efficiency. Motorcars whisked them through streets clogged with traffic, past shops overflowing with goods, past crowds that seemed better fed and better dressed than any European city Durant had seen since 1914. Their first meeting was scheduled for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Durant had expected something modest, perhaps elegant. The Bank of England was a neoclassical temple. The Banque de France occupied a Renaissance palace. Central banks were meant to project permanence, tradition, gravitas. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was a fortress. The building occupied an entire city block. Renaissance revival architecture executed in limestone and sandstone, but scaled to American proportions. Massive, immovable, intimidating. They entered through bronze doors that could have sealed a vault. Inside, the lobby was more cathedral than bank, with vaulted ceilings and marble columns that made footsteps echo like gunshots. "Gentlemen, welcome." Their guide was a young vice president named Harrison, crisp and businesslike. "If you'll follow me, we'll begin with a tour of the facilities." Facilities. Such an American word, clinical and industrial. They descended, and descended, and descended. The elevator cage rattled down 5 floors below street level into bedrock. When the doors opened, Durant stepped into a chamber that made his breath catch. The vault was impossible. Steel and concrete stretched in every direction, segmented into cages, each cage stacked floor to ceiling with gold bars. Electric lights blazed from the ceiling, reflecting off metal, until the air itself seemed golden. The temperature was cold, controlled, the humidity regulated by machines whose hum Durant could feel in his chest. "This facility," Harrison said, his voice echoing, "currently holds approximately 20% of the world's monetary gold, over 13,000 tons." Wentworth made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Durant walked between the cages as if in a dream. Each bar was stamped with marks indicating origin, purity, weight. He saw French stamps, British stamps, Russian imperial eagles, German Reichsmarks, all here, all locked behind American steel, all part of the great transfer that had financed the war. "These cages," Harrison continued, gesturing, "are assigned to foreign central banks. You can think of this vault as the world's safe deposit facility. Of course, the largest holdings belong to the U.S. Treasury itself." He led them deeper, to where the cages were unmarked, where the gold bars, stacked 20 feet high, stretched into shadow. "This section contains approximately 45% of the world's monetary gold reserves. U.S. government holdings." Durant's mind reeled at the mathematics. If America held 45% and foreign deposits added another 20%, that meant... "You hold 2/3 of the world's gold," he said quietly. Harrison smiled. "Give or take. The exact figure fluctuates with international settlements. But yes, Mr. Durant, approximately 2/3. In the cold air of the vault, 5 stories beneath Manhattan, surrounded by more gold than had ever been gathered in one place in human history, Durant felt something crack inside his certainty. They had known America was rich. They hadn't understood what rich meant. The tour continued. They saw the assay labs, where gold was tested, with equipment more sophisticated than anything in Europe. They saw the counting rooms, where clerks with mechanical calculators tracked international flows in real time. They saw the communication center, where telegraphs and telephones connected New York to every major financial center in the world, creating a web of information that moved at the speed of electricity. "We process approximately 600 transactions per day," Harrison explained. "International settlements, gold shipments, credit clearances. The system is designed for scale." Scale. There was that word again. That afternoon they toured the New York Stock Exchange. Durant had been to the Paris Bourse, a genteel establishment where stock jobbers conducted business in civilized tones. The NYSE was chaos, beautiful, terrifying chaos. The trading floor was a seething mass of men in vests, shouting, waving papers, scrambling between posts while electrical tickers clattered overhead. Millions of shares changed hands every hour. The noise was deafening. "Daily volume," their NYSE guide shouted over the din. "Averaged 4 million shares last year. We expect 5 million this year. The exchange is equipped to handle significantly more." Durant watched a trade being executed, a telegraph from Chicago, decoded by a clerk, shouted to a broker, filled within seconds, confirmed back to Chicago. The entire transaction took less than 2 minutes. In Paris, the same trade would require forms, signatures, meetings. Here, it was done before he could blink. That evening, At dinner in the Waldorf Astoria, the European delegation sat in subdued silence. The hotel's Louis XVI ballroom could have been transplanted from Versailles, but the building itself was a steel-framed skyscraper. The food arrived on electric dumbwaiters, and the wine list included California vintages that cost as much as French Burgundy. Wentworth broke the silence. "They're not children." "No," Durant agreed quietly. "They're not." A Belgian banker, Van der Meer, elderly and pessimistic, lit a cigar with shaking hands. "Did you see the vault? Did you see how much gold they have?" "We knew they had gold," someone said. "Knowing and seeing are different things." Van der Meer's voice was bitter. "They could buy Europe, literally buy it, property by property, factory by factory. They have enough gold to purchase the continent." Durant pushed food around his plate. In his mind, he kept seeing those endless cages of bullion, kept hearing Harrison's casual voice, 45% of the world's monetary gold, not earned through centuries of trade and empire, but accumulated in 4 years of neutrality-turned-profiteering. "Tomorrow," Wentworth said, "we meet with the Federal Reserve Board. Perhaps the negotiations will be more constructive." But his voice carried no conviction. They all knew, though none would say it aloud. They had come to New York expecting to negotiate between equals. They had arrived to discover they were supplicants. The Federal Reserve Board meeting took place in an anonymous office building in Lower Manhattan. No grand architecture here, just efficiency, wood-paneled rooms, leather chairs, the smell of strong coffee and tobacco. Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was younger than Durant expected, mid-40s, with thinning hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted them warmly, shook hands, made small talk about their journey. Then he opened a folder. "Gentlemen, let's discuss the current structure of international obligations." For 2 hours, Strong walked them through a web of debt so complex, so interconnected, that Durant struggled to follow. Germany owed reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain owed war debts to America. But Germany couldn't pay without economic recovery. German recovery required American loans. French recovery required German payments. British recovery required both. "What you're describing," Durant said slowly, "is a circular system. Everything depends on everything else." "Exactly." Strong smiled. "Which is why the Federal Reserve has taken responsibility for managing international liquidity. Someone must ensure the system functions." Taken responsibility. The phrase hung in the air. Not been asked to help or agreed to assist. Taken responsibility. As if it were natural, inevitable, that America would manage the world's financial flows. Wentworth leaned forward. "Governor Strong, you must understand that European central banks have managed international finance for centuries, and we respect that tradition immensely." Strong's voice was polite but firm. "However, the war changed certain fundamental realities. The United States is now the world's largest creditor nation. We hold the majority of monetary gold. Our economy produces more than Britain, France, and Germany combined. These facts create responsibilities. Responsibilities, not power, responsibilities. As if America's dominance were a burden they'd reluctantly accepted, rather than a position they'd deliberately created." Durant spoke carefully. "What exactly are you proposing?" Strong stood, walked to a wall map showing international credit flows. Red lines connected America to Europe, to South America, to Asia. The lines were arrows, all pointing outward from New York. "We're already implementing this system. The Dawes Plan will stabilize Germany with American credit. U.S. loans will help Britain return to the gold standard. French reconstruction bonds will be underwritten by American banks. The Federal Reserve will coordinate international interest rates to maintain equilibrium." "In other words," Van der Meer said bitterly, "Europe becomes dependent on American lending." In other words, Strong corrected, we build a stable system for international prosperity, one that prevents future wars by creating mutual economic interest in peace. The logic was seductive. Durant could see the appeal, a world managed by rational economic planning rather than imperial rivalry. But the implications made him cold. If Germany needed American loans to pay reparations, and France needed reparations to pay America, then France's sovereignty was an illusion. They were all dancing on strings, held in New York. Over lunch, Strong became more candid. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns. You're accustomed to a multipolar financial world, London, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, all competing. But that world died in August 1914. What emerges from the war will be simpler, more centralized, and frankly, more stable." "Centralized in New York," Durant said. "Where else?" Strong's shrug was almost apologetic. "We have the gold. We have the surplus capital. We have the only major economy that wasn't destroyed by the war. Nature abhors a vacuum, Mr. Durant. So does international finance." That afternoon, Durant walked alone through Central Park, trying to clear his head. The autumn leaves were changing, gold and red against a sky so blue it hurt. American children played baseball on the grass. Couples strolled past without care. The war felt 1,000 miles away, not just geographically, but temporally, as if America existed in a different timeline, one where 1914-1918 had been an inconvenience rather than an apocalypse. He found a bench, sat, watched pigeons scrabble for crumbs. The truth was unavoidable now. Europe had spent 4 years bleeding, while America had spent 4 years growing. The war had been a transfer mechanism, moving wealth across the Atlantic in exchange for weapons, food, and credit. The gold in that vast vault beneath Manhattan, that was European power, European sovereignty, European future, all locked behind American steel. And the system Strong described, this new financial architecture, it was already functioning. Durant had seen the evidence in every meeting. American banks were already making loans that European banks couldn't. American credit was already supporting governments that would have collapsed without it. The Federal Reserve was already coordinating international policy, and European central banks were already deferring to their decisions. When had it happened? When had the shift occurred? Not in a single moment, Durant realized. Not in one dramatic transfer of power. It had been gradual, transaction by transaction, loan by loan, gold bar by gold bar. Europe had been so focused on winning the war that they hadn't noticed they were losing something more fundamental. That evening, the delegation dined with American bankers at Delmonico's. The conversation was jovial, backslapping. The Americans talked about expansion, new markets in South America, opportunities in Asia, industrial growth that would continue for decades. They seemed to assume European cooperation, as if the old competition between London and Paris and Berlin was ancient history. One American banker, slightly drunk, leaned close to Durant. "You fellows should come work with us. Real opportunity here. The future's being built in America, whether Europe likes it or not." Durant smiled politely and excused himself early. Back at his hotel, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the lights of Manhattan blaze against the night. In his room, the radiator clanked and hissed, American heating keeping the cold at bay. On the street below, motor cars honked and rumbled, never stopping, the city alive at midnight in a way no European city could match. "We're going to lose," he thought. "Not all at once, but slowly, inexorably. We'll keep pretending we're still in charge, keep pretending London and Paris still matter. But the decisions will be made here. The credit will flow from here. And gradually, year by year, Europe will become a satellite, unless something changed, unless Europe could somehow regain control of the system. But how? They didn't have the gold. They didn't have the capital. They didn't have the industrial base. America had won not through military genius, but through simple arithmetic. They had more, they made more, they owned more. And mathematics, Durant knew, was the only truth that mattered in finance. 9 years later. October 1929. Durant was in his Paris office when the telegrams started arriving from New York. At first they were routine, market volatility, some profit-taking after the long boom. But by afternoon, the language shifted. Sharp decline. Severe losses. Panic selling. By evening, catastrophic collapse. The New York Stock Exchange had crashed. Not just corrected, not just declined. Crashed. Billions of dollars in paper wealth had evaporated in hours. American banks were suspending operations. Credit was freezing. Durant stood at his window, watching night fall over Paris, and felt a terrible certainty settle over him. If America sneezed, Europe would catch pneumonia. The entire post-war system was built on American credit, American lending, American confidence. If that confidence broke, the collapse came faster than anyone imagined possible. Within weeks, American banks began calling in foreign loans. They had no choice. They needed liquidity to survive. But Europe depended on those loans for everything. German factories had been rebuilt with American credit. British trade was financed by American capital. French reconstruction bonds were held by American investors. When America stopped lending, the circular flow that Benjamin Strong had described so confidently in 1920 collapsed. Germany couldn't pay reparations without American loans. France couldn't pay America without German reparations. Britain couldn't maintain the gold standard without both. The entire elegant system of international finance revealed itself to be a house of cards, and America, unintentionally, almost casually, had removed the foundation. By 1931, Durant was watching his life's work crumble. The gold standard, that eternal pillar of financial civilization, was disintegrating. Britain abandoned it in September. France held on grimly, but the Banque de France was hemorrhaging gold. Germany descended into economic chaos that would soon birth something much darker. Durant was older now, greyer, the lines in his face carved deep by stress and disillusionment. He sat in emergency meetings where officials who'd once spoken confidently about European monetary policy now begged for American intervention. But America was consumed by its own crisis, its own political upheaval. The Federal Reserve, which had managed the world's finances with such confidence a decade earlier, was paralyzed. One evening, Durant received a dinner invitation from an old colleague, now retired. They met at a restaurant they'd frequented before the war, a place where everything was the same, the white tablecloths and silver service, but everything was different. "Do you remember 1920? His friend asked. "When we went to New York? Of course. You came back changed. You tried to warn us. You said America was becoming too central, too dominant, that we were building a system that depended on their stability." Durant smiled bitterly. No one wanted to hear it. We all preferred to believe Europe still mattered. "And now?" Durant gestured at the empty restaurant, at the Paris streets beyond where unemployed men lined up at soup kitchens. "Now we know the truth. European monetary sovereignty is finished. We can pretend we'll keep our central banks, our treasuries, our gold reserves. But when it matters, when crisis comes, we're passengers. America is the driver. So what do we do? What can we do? Wait. Hope America recovers. Hope they're generous. Hope they understand that their stability is now the world's stability." Durant's laugh was harsh. "We built an empire on Europe's terms for centuries. Now we live in a world built on American terms, and we have no choice but to accept it." The catastrophe continued. Austria's largest bank, Kreditanstalt, collapsed in May 1931, triggering a cascade of failures across Central Europe. Germany's government teetered on the edge of legitimacy. Unemployment in industrial cities reached 40%. The political center couldn't hold. And through it all, Durant watched and understood. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was the death of Europe's financial independence. The Americans hadn't meant to break the system. They'd been focused on their own problems. But that was precisely the point. Europe's fate now depended on American decisions made for American reasons. What happened in Washington and New York mattered more than what happened in Paris or London or Berlin. The world had tilted. The center of gravity had shifted, and there was no shifting it back. Today, more than a century after that delegation toured the Fed vaults, the world financial system remains fundamentally American. The dollar represents nearly 60% of global currency reserves. International commodities, oil, gold, wheat, are priced in dollars. The SWIFT system for international payments runs through American-controlled infrastructure. When the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, emerging markets tremble. When the U.S. Treasury imposes sanctions, they're more devastating than military blockades. Europe has the euro, yes, but the Eurozone lacks fiscal union, lacks a true central bank with full sovereignty, lacks the integrated power of the American system. Asia has grown wealthy, but most of that wealth is denominated in dollars, held in dollar assets, dependent on dollar liquidity. The irony is that most Americans don't realize they live at the center of a financial empire. They see their crumbling infrastructure, their political dysfunction, their social problems. They don't see the invisible architecture that makes their currency the world's currency, that allows their government to borrow at rates no other nation could access, that lets them export inflation and import goods on terms that would bankrupt any other country. But the rest of the world sees it. Every central banker, every finance minister, every economist who studies international monetary policy understands what Émile Durant understood in 1920. America became the world's banker, not through conspiracy, but through arithmetic. They had the gold when it mattered. They had the credit when it was needed. They had the stability when Europe was tearing itself apart. And they built a system that institutionalized these advantages, that made them permanent, that turned temporary superiority into structural dominance. The question that haunts financial capitals from Beijing to Brussels is simple. Will this system last forever? History suggests no empire is eternal. Reserve currencies change. The Spanish real gave way to the Dutch guilder, which gave way to the British pound, which gave way to the American dollar. Each transition was traumatic, disruptive, world-changing. Perhaps someday historians will write about the day China realized America's financial empire was crumbling, or the moment the dollar's dominance ended. Perhaps there will be another tour of vaults, another delegation shocked by the sheer scale of a rising power's gold reserves or digital currency holdings. But for now, for this moment in history, the system built in the aftermath of World War I endures. When you buy coffee priced in your local currency, somewhere in the background, that transaction touched the dollar system. When your government issues bonds, international investors compare the rates to U.S. Treasury yields. When a crisis hits anywhere in the world, capital flows toward American assets. The day Europe realized America was becoming the world's banker wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was the birth of the world we inhabit, the financial architecture we navigate, the hidden empire we all live inside. And that empire, built not with armies, but with credit, not with colonies, but with currencies, not with conquest, but with confidence, remains the most powerful force in global affairs. Because empires built on gold can be challenged. Empires built on credit, on faith, on trust, on the collective belief that one nation's currency represents universal value. Those empires are almost impossible to topple, until they aren't. Until that day, we all live in the world America's vaults created, a world where financial power matters more than military might, where the flow of credit determines the fate of nations, where a single country's central bank acts as lender of last resort to an entire planet. The Europeans who toured the Fed in 1920 glimpsed this future and recoiled from it. Their children lived through its establishment. Their grandchildren now accept it as natural. But nothing in history is natural. Everything is built. Everything can be unmade. The question is not whether America's financial dominance will end. The question is, what comes next? And who will be standing in the vaults when the next shift occurs, experiencing the same shock of recognition that Émile Durant felt on that October day in 1920, when he realized the world had already changed and no one in Europe had noticed until it was far too late? The system endures, the architecture holds, the dollar reigns, for now.